A couple days ago, Quartz published a story about a Microsoft employee who they claim was openly challenging the value of diversity, which is a strange framing when you learn this employee was actually complaining about discrimination against white males and Asians. Because of this framing, many people view it like a Damore 2.0. For those who aren't familiar, Damore drafted the infamous Google memo and was subsequently fired and smeared in the media as being a misogynist. This employee was upset about perceived racial discrimination. And this shows us how the left actually doesn't understand the idea of diversity, and it actually shows how they're kind of racist. Being Asian doesn't mean you are just Chinese, but of course, they kind of lump in Indians, Chinese with all other Asians, and then act like anyone who's upset about this clearly must oppose diversity. Well, data from the past shows us diversity programs tend not to work, and now we can see the inherent conundrum. Someone who is upset about racial discrimination is being smeared in the press. Today, let's take a look at this story as well as some data from the past showing that diversity programs actually tend to backfire. But before we get started, make sure you follow me over on Minds at minds.com/timcast. I often cover controversial issues which don't grant me any favor with some of these big tech monopolies, so I definitely want to make sure I have people following me on a different platform like Minds. Now, if you want to support this video, just share it on social media to help spread the news. The story from Quartz. Microsoft staff are openly questioning the value of diversity. The story says some Microsoft employees are openly questioning whether diversity is important in a lengthy discussion on an internal online messaging board meant for communicating with CEO Satya Nadella. Two posts on the board criticizing Microsoft diversity initiatives as discriminatory hiring and suggesting that women are less suited for engineering roles have elicited more than 800 comments, both affirming and criticizing the viewpoints. Multiple Microsoft employees have told Quartz. The posts were written by a female Microsoft program manager. Quartz reached out to her directly for comment and isn't making her name public at this point, pending her response. Discussion is very important. The first thing I want to point out before moving on is that it seems like this story is framed to oppose any conversation about the value of certain programs. Of course, people should be talking about it, and I'm not sure why they find this newsworthy, but they do, which may be bad news for this female employee, as they say they may release her name pending her response. Does Microsoft have any plans to end the current policy that financially incentivizes discriminatory hiring practices? To be clear, I am referring to the fact that senior leadership is awarded more money if they discriminate against Asians and white men. Read the original post by the Microsoft program manager on Yammer, a corporate messaging platform owned by Microsoft. The employee commented consistently throughout the thread, making similar arguments. Quartz reviewed lengthy sections of the internal discussion provided by Microsoft employees. I have an ever-increasing file of white male Microsoft employees who have faced outright and overt discrimination because they had the misfortune of being born both white and male. This is unacceptable, the program manager wrote in a comment later. The Microsoft employees who spoke to Quartz said they weren't aware of any action by the company in response, despite the comments being reported to Microsoft's Human Resource Department. Expanding on the story, The Verge writes, Microsoft faces down a new claim that pro-diversity hiring isn't fair to white men. Controversial internal message board threads are highlighting dissent at Microsoft. Microsoft employees have been using an internal message board to criticize the company's pro-diversity efforts, referring to the hiring of women and minorities as discriminatory against white and Asian men, according to a report from Quartz. Microsoft has left these threads untouched, drawing criticism from other employees who feel the company talks up its diversity and inclusion efforts, but takes little meaningful action to reinforce them at a cultural level. The reason I highlight the story from The Verge is because both Quartz and The Verge are framing the narrative in a way to mislead you. They say, referring to the hiring of women and minorities as discriminatory against white and Asian men. But of course, that's a false framing. In reality, people are upset when someone who applies for a job is told they can't have it simply because of their race. There are important factors to include why someone would be upset by discrimination against white or Asians. Notably that, as we know, Asians are not a monolith. And it's actually rather shocking to me that this has gone on for so long, with the left claiming to be anti-racist, but making the assumption that all Asians are the same race. That's extremely racist. Here we can see from the Associated Press that Indian and Chinese Asians are more likely to have a bachelor's degree, but Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian are much less likely to have a degree. This is just a small group of what we would consider to be Asian. It tends to be Indians and Chinese people who are getting these lucrative positions. Thus, many people who struggle to come to the US who are poor are being discriminated against when they are poor simply for looking a certain way. The Verge does note, however, that It appears Microsoft employees are pushing back against the notion that women and minorities in tech face outsized discrimination and harassment by saying the company is overcorrecting in its hiring practices and incentivizing managers to avoid hiring white and Asian men, which are predominantly representative of the tech workforce at every single major company in the industry. No disciplinary action appears to have been taken against any employees involved in these threads. The Verge then links to this story from Recode, which actually doesn't say anything about white men or Asian men. The Verge and Quartz are both upset that the conversation is happening. But think about civil rights in general. The only reason anyone won their civil rights is because they refused to be quiet about it. Now, I certainly don't think it's the same situation. You have companies that are saying we're going to incentivize people not to hire white men or Asians, and that is problematic, especially when you note not everyone is wealthy, and just because someone looks a certain way doesn't mean they have more or less access. It's kind of crazy. The overlying issue here is that the more they try to solve the problem, the worse it becomes. We know this is the case because we've had data for years showing that not only does diversity training backfire, but that a diversity initiative doesn't actually do anything for the most part. In a report from the Harvard Business Review titled, "Why Diversity Programs Fail," they say, it shouldn't be surprising that most diversity programs aren't increasing diversity. Despite a few new bells and whistles courtesy of big data, companies are basically doubling down on the same approaches they've used since the 1960s, which often make things worse, not better. Firms have long relied on diversity training to reduce bias on the job, hiring tests, and performance ratings to limit it in recruitment and promotions, and grievance systems to give employees a way to challenge managers. Those tools are designed to preempt lawsuits by policing managers' thoughts and actions. Yet laboratory studies show that this kind of force feeding can activate bias rather than stamp it out. As social scientists have found, people often rebel against rules to assert their autonomy. Try to coerce me to do X, Y, or Z, and I'll do the opposite just to prove that I'm my own person. They say why you can't just outlaw bias. Executives favor a classic command and control approach to diversity because it boils expected behaviors down to do's and don'ts that are easy to understand and defend. Yet this approach also flies in the face of nearly everything we know about how to motivate people to make changes. Decades of social science research point to a simple truth. You won't get managers on board by blaming and shaming them with rules and re-education. What makes this story so interesting is that its emergence seems to coincide with claims of discrimination and sexual harassment. This story from Quartz, April 4th. Amid employee uproar, Microsoft is investigating sexual harassment claims overlooked by HR. And about a week later, they decided to revamp HR practices after an email chain complaining about discrimination and harassment spread through the company. But it seems all it did was lead to more complaints about discrimination and harassment. The issue of racial and sexual discrimination is extremely complicated. It seems like in response to skin color discrimination or national origin or religion, they responded by doing literally the exact same thing, but in the other way. It's almost like there's no happy medium, or at least we haven't figured out how to do it. Diversity training backfires, diversity programs backfire. But then when you actually incentivize managers to not hire one race or another, how is that actually solving the problem? You're only making it backfire. Let me just break it down to its root. You want to make sure people aren't being discriminated against based on their sex or race. So you implement a program to incentivize them to discriminate based on sex or race. And the best example of how this is overt racism coming from the left is the idea that all Asians are the same thing, when in fact, there are many different countries. In fact, in the UK, they refer to the Middle East as Asians. So are you going to claim that Chinese people, Indians, and Arabic individuals are all Asian and thus are overrepresented? That's 3 different ethnic groups. And you can easily point to the fact that many Southeast Asians are poor. They struggle to emigrate here, and when they do, they face the brunt of discrimination because of these programs. But lo and behold, left-wing media is outraged that anyone would dare challenge their overtly racist practice. As we know, these progressive activists tend to be overwhelmingly white, so I'm not surprised when they think all Asians are the same. It's a very, very racist idea to have, and they try to uphold it by silencing discussion. Invariably, we see the left-wing media come to the defense of racist practices. And I can't say I'm surprised. It seems like most people are more concerned with tribal issues than actually solving these problems. If an employee comes forward and says, hey, that's discrimination, we shouldn't allow incentivizing people to be hired based on race, well, they say you're challenging diversity. It's a smear. It's meant to make you look bad. And now they flout that they may release this individual's name because we know what happens when you do. James Damore faced the brunt of that. He was smeared in the press endlessly, even to this day, which is so funny to see Quartz absolutely did the same thing, saying that it echoes James Damore, who in 2017 wrote a memo that went internally viral at Google, leaning on pseudoscience to argue that women aren't cut out for the tech industry. Damore was fired for breaching the company's code of conduct amid enormous public and internal controversy. And Google CEO Sundar Pichai wrote in a memo that the firing was due to advancing harmful gender stereotypes in our workplace, which is all just 100% wrong. James Damore never said women weren't cut out. He said, as men and women are different, perhaps we need different working environments for women, which is actually a very feminist take on the situation. But of course, he was fired, smeared, and accused of pushing pseudoscience, when in fact, James Damore himself is a scientist. This is an issue of the culture war. In my opinion, it has nothing to do with whether you're right or wrong. It has nothing to do with ending racial discrimination. Because as we can see, when you try to fight against it, they will smear you and accuse you of opposing diversity. Meanwhile, they claim all Asians are the same. Really funny then, that they can't recognize the difference in race and ethnicity from an entire continent. So I'd have to wonder, what's the real goal of this? And I just feel like it's power. They want power, they want to push people down, and if you're not part of their tribe, they're gonna throw you out. Well, let me know what you think in the comments below. We'll keep the conversation going. You can follow me on Minds at Timcast. Stay tuned, new videos every day at 4 p.m. Eastern. And I'll have more videos for you on my second channel, youtube.com/TimcastNews, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all next time.